She had rebuilt herself for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of silence, of learning how to breathe without looking over her shoulder, of telling herself that the worst was already behind her. And then he showed up at her door at 11:03 p.m., soaked in rain, looking like a man who had crossed through fire just to find her address. Kang Min-jae, the name that made entire corporations go quiet. The man whose shadow stretched across Seoul's underground like a second city nobody talked about. 3 words. That was all he said. I want you back. If you've ever loved someone dangerous, truly, bone-deep dangerous, and still opened the door anyway, stay with me to the very end of this story. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The rain started around 9 that night. Nyla Adebayo noticed it the way she noticed most things in Seoul, practically, without sentiment. She checked the weather app, saw the yellow warning icon, and pulled on her heavier coat before leaving the convenience store 2 blocks from her apartment. By the time she turned onto her street, the rain had shifted from drizzle to something heavier and more deliberate, the kind that soaked through fabric before you fully realized it was happening. She had groceries in one hand and her phone in the other, a half-typed message to her friend Yemi still open on the screen. She was thinking about rice. She was thinking about whether she had gochujang left in the refrigerator. She was thinking about exactly nothing important. That was the thing about the 6 weeks since she left Daesung Global Holdings. She had learned how to think about nothing important. It was a skill she'd had to teach herself deliberately, the way you'd learn to walk again after a bad fall. Conscious, methodical, requiring constant attention. Because Nyla's brain was not built for stillness. It had been running diagnostics on spreadsheets and organizational charts since she was 19 years old, finding the cracks in structures that other people swore were solid, filling in the gaps that executives collected paychecks for ignoring, turning chaos into something that could be measured and corrected. For 3 years, she'd done that at Daesung Global. For 3 years, she had held an empire together with her bare hands, while the men who owned that empire found increasingly creative ways to pretend she wasn't there. So yes, thinking about rice and gochujang was a conscious choice, a recovery strategy. Her therapist back in Accra would have called it healthy. Her mother would have called it something considerably less diplomatic. Nyla had covered the last 20 meters to her building when she saw the man. He was leaning against the wall beside the entrance, just far enough inside the shadow of the overhang that the security light above the door didn't quite reach his face. Tall, still, completely unaffected by the rain that was soaking everyone else on the street. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't checking the time. He was just standing there the way that certain types of men stand, not waiting for anything specific, but watching for everything in general. Her feet slowed before her brain consciously registered why. 3 years in the orbit of Kang Min-jae had recalibrated her instincts whether she wanted them recalibrated or not. You spent enough time in proximity to organized violence, you started to recognize the particular posture of it, the controlled stillness, the way a man like that never quite turns his back on an open street. She kept walking. She did not change her pace. She reached the door, punched in the code, and stepped inside without looking directly at him. Upstairs, she locked her apartment door, put her groceries on the counter, and stood in the dark of her kitchen for almost 2 full minutes without moving. Then she got out her phone and called the only number that made any sense to call. It rang 4 times. 5. She was about to hang up when the line connected and she heard breathing before words. Nyla. His voice was exactly the same as she remembered, low and deliberate, each syllable placed with the precision of a man who had learned early that words, spoken carelessly, could get people killed. "There's a man outside my building," she said. She kept her voice flat. She was proud of that. A pause. Not long. 3 seconds at most. But Min-jae's pauses always contained more information than other people's sentences, and she had spent 3 years learning to read them. "I know," he said. The cold that moved through her had nothing to do with the rain still drying in her hair. "You know. He's mine. He's not there to hurt you. He's yours." She set her phone down on the counter and switched to speaker because her hand had started doing something she refused to call trembling. "Kang Min-jae, are you telling me that you put a man outside my building without telling me?" "I'm telling you now." "That is not the same thing." "Nyla, how long?" She opened the refrigerator. She didn't want anything from it. She just needed something to do with her hands. How long has someone been outside my building? Another pause. 11 days. She closed the refrigerator. She pressed her palm flat against the cool metal of the door and looked at the watercolor print on her kitchen wall. A piece of art she'd bought from a market near Insadong on a Sunday afternoon 6 months ago. One of the first things she'd purchased for the apartment that had nothing to do with functionality and everything to do with the fact that she liked it. She had been trying to learn how to do that, like things just because she liked them. I want you to remove him, she said. There's a reason he's there. I don't care about your reason. Remove him, or I call the police and tell them there's a man loitering outside my building. The police in this district won't. Then I go outside and I talk to him myself. She picked up the phone again, took it off speaker. How do you think that conversation ends, Min-jae? Because I will have it. You know me well enough to believe that. She heard him exhale, a slow, controlled breath that in anyone else might have sounded like defeat, but in him sounded more like calculation. There's a situation, he said finally. Someone has been asking questions about you, about your connection to the company. I don't have a connection to the company anymore. I resigned. People like the ones asking questions don't care about resignation letters. The watercolor print on her kitchen wall stared back at her, blues and greens, a woman standing in front of the sea. Come and explain it to me yourself, Nyla said. Not over the phone. Here. Tonight. Nyla, it's almost 10 o'clock. Tonight, or I remove your man myself. She ended the call before he could answer. This. She made tea she didn't drink. She sat on her couch with her legs folded under her and her laptop open to a document she'd been building for 3 weeks. The structural outline of the consulting firm she was going to launch, if she could stop second-guessing the revenue projections long enough to finalize the business registration. She stared at the columns without reading them. Outside, the rain intensified, hammering the window glass in waves. An hour passed. At 5 minutes past 11, there was a knock at her door. She didn't move immediately. She sat for 3 more seconds, a petty act of control she allowed herself. And then she unfolded from the couch and crossed the apartment to the door. She checked the peephole first. Her chest did something complicated and unwanted when she saw him. Kang Min-jae looked, in the fisheye distortion of the peephole, like a man who had just survived something. His hair was soaked through. His coat was dark with rain all the way to the hem. He wasn't checking his phone or straightening his collar or doing any of the composed, deliberate things she was accustomed to watching him do. He was just standing in her hallway with his hands at his sides, looking at her door with the particular expression of a man who doesn't know if it's going to open. She opened it. For a moment, neither of them said anything. This was the first time she had seen him in 6 weeks. The first time she had been within 10 meters of him since the afternoon. She placed her resignation letter on the desk of the HR director. Not his desk, pointedly, deliberately, because handing it to him would have meant standing in front of him, and she hadn't trusted herself to stand in front of him and still walk away. He looked tired. She had never seen Kang Min-jae look tired in 3 years of working beside him. Stressed, occasionally. Controlled, always. But this was something different. There were shadows under his eyes that didn't belong to the late hour. A tension in his jaw that looked like it had been living there for weeks. You came, she said. Not warmly, just as an observation. You said tonight. I did. She stepped back from the doorway. Come in before the hallway floods. He sat in the one chair in her living room that faced the door. She noticed this because it was the same instinct she'd watched him exercise in every meeting room, every restaurant, every space she'd ever shared with him. He never sat with his back to an entrance. It was the kind of habit that told you something about how a person had grown up, what they'd learned to fear. She sat on the couch across from him, tucked one leg under herself and held her mug of cold tea because it gave her something to hold. Talk, she said. Min-jae looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't immediately name. Then he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and started. His name is Cho Seung-won, he said. He runs an operation out of Incheon, shipping, on paper, other things underneath. Syndicate? He met her eyes. Yes, she had known. She had known for much longer than she was comfortable admitting to herself, in the way that intelligent people often know things they're not ready to deal with. You file the information away somewhere you don't look too often, let it sit in the dark, and focus on the things directly in front of you. Seung-won and I have history, Min-jae continued, competing interests, territory, the standard ugliness. For years we managed it without direct conflict. He paused. When you resigned and left the company, it changed the calculation. Why would my resignation affect your relationship with another syndicate? He looked at the window. Rain moved across the glass in sheets. Because you knew things, Nyla. Not all of it consciously. But 3 years inside Daesung Global, with the access you had, financial structures, account patterns, operational calendars, you accumulated information that certain people would consider valuable. A pause. Or dangerous. The word landed in the room and stayed there. I'm not going to do anything with information about Daesung's finances, she said. I left. I'm building something of my own. I have zero interest in... I know that. Then explain to me why this Seung-won person cares about me. Min-jae was quiet for a moment. He turned his eyes back to her, and there was something in them that she recognized slowly, the way you recognize a song you haven't heard in years, starting with the feeling before the words come back to you. He doesn't believe you, Min-jae said, and even if he did, you knowing things isn't the only issue. He stopped, started again more carefully. Seung-won has been looking for leverage against me for a long time. Different kinds of leverage. Business leverage, political leverage. Another pause, heavier this time. Personal leverage. The apartment was very quiet except for the rain. Nyla set her mug down on the coffee table. He thinks, she said slowly, working through it, that you care about me. Enough that threatening me would affect your decisions. Min-jae didn't answer immediately, which was an answer. Min-jae. Yes. Flat. Final. He thinks that. She stood up from the couch. She wasn't sure why. Her body just needed to be upright, needed the option of movement. She walked to the window and looked out at the Seoul night below, rain-blurred neon and headlights, and the ordinary chaos of a city that didn't know or care about any of this. Is he right? She asked. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Nyla, I'm not asking about feelings. She turned around. I'm asking a tactical question. Is he right that threatening me would affect your decisions? Min-jae stood up too. He was taller than she sometimes remembered when she was away from him. The apartment shrank around him in a way that office buildings, with their high ceilings and executive floors, had somehow obscured. Here, in her small living room with its one decent couch and the watercolor from Insadong and the half-built consulting firm open on her laptop screen, he was just a very tall man in a wet coat who had come when she called. Yes, he said. He's right. Nyla breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth the way her therapist had taught her. Okay, she said. So you put a man outside my building. Yes. Without telling me. I didn't want to frighten you. Min-jae, she pressed her fingers to the bridge of her nose. I am frightened. I was already frightened before I knew the reason. Finding an unknown man watching my building and then discovering he was yours did not reduce my fear. It changed the source of it. He absorbed this. She watched him do it, watched the almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes that meant he was recalculating, updating an internal model. You're right, he said quietly. Those 2 words from Kang Min-jae were worth more than entire apologies from other men, and she hated that she knew that. Hated that 3 years had given her a fluency in him that she couldn't simply unlearn just because she'd resigned and gone home and tried to think about rice and gochujang. Tell me the rest, she said. Bong. He told her. Not all of it. She understood even as he spoke that what she was hearing was a carefully curated version of the truth. The parts of it he'd decided she needed in order to be safe, organized and filtered through whatever internal algorithm governed what Kang Min-jae chose to reveal. But it was more than he'd ever told her in 3 years at Daesung Global, and that difference was significant enough to sit with. Cho Seung-won had been running shipping operations through Incheon for 6 years. Legitimate containers carrying electronics and auto parts on paper, other things underneath. His operation had grown into territory that overlapped with Min-jae's interests. Not always directly, not always hostilely, but the friction had been building for 2 years with the particular slow burn inevitability of 2 structures occupying the same space. When Nyla left Daisung Global and the company began its visible spiral, losing clients, hemorrhaging internal stability, watching executive after executive get caught up in the audits that were an indirect consequence of the corruption she'd spent 3 years documenting in her head without ever quite acknowledging she was doing so, Seong-won had started making inquiries about her specifically. "He's intelligent," Min-jae said, in the tone of a man giving an opponent their due credit with minimal enthusiasm. "He correctly assessed that you'd been central to the company's operational health. He incorrectly assessed that you'd be motivated to cause damage on your way out." "I wasn't motivated to cause damage. I just wanted to leave." "I know." "Then why didn't you tell him that?" Min-jae looked at her steadily. "Because he wouldn't believe it from me. And because telling Seong-won I had a personal interest in you would have accelerated exactly the situation I was trying to prevent." Nyla stared at the ceiling for a moment. "So by protecting me quietly, you made the situation worse?" "Yes." "Great." She returned to the couch. "Excellent strategy." There was a pause that in any other context might have been awkward, but in their particular dynamic felt more like two people recalibrating. "I thought I was managing it," Min-jae said. "You thought you were managing it." She folded her hands in her lap. "You thought, as you have apparently thought for 3 entire years, that the correct response to a problem involving me was to manage it without involving me." He had the grace not to argue with this. "Every humiliation in that office," Nyla said, and her voice came out quieter and harder than she intended. "Every meeting I built that they locked me out of, every presentation my name disappeared from, every time Lee Dae-hyun spoke to me like I was something on the bottom of his shoe." She paused. "You were there for most of it. You saw it." "Yes." "And you stayed quiet." "Yes." "Why?" She looked at him directly, willing him to give her a real answer rather than a strategic one. Not the tactical explanation, the real one. Min-jae looked at his hands. It was such an uncharacteristically human gesture that it momentarily stopped her train of thought. Kang Min-jae, looking at his own hands like he was searching them for something. "Because if I intervened loudly," he said slowly, "it would have drawn attention to how much I cared. And attention to that, in my world, creates exactly the vulnerability that Seong-won eventually found anyway." He paused. "I convinced myself that small protections were enough. Erasing you from certain records, redirecting certain conversations, keeping certain people away from your immediate orbit without you knowing they'd been redirected." His jaw tightened. It was cowardice dressed up as strategy. The rain outside made the silence feel heavier. "It was cowardice," Nyla agreed. "Not cruelly, just accurately." He didn't flinch. She found she respected him slightly more for that. "You let them diminish me," she said, "publicly, repeatedly, over years. And maybe you had reasons that felt coherent inside the logic of your world. But from where I was standing, from where I still stand, what I experienced was a man who cared enough to know exactly how I took my coffee, but not enough to say my name out loud when it mattered." The words sat between them like something physical. Min-jae stood up from the chair. He moved to the window, standing where she had stood 10 minutes ago, looking down at the same rain-blurred city. His back was to her, which she knew meant something. He had never voluntarily put his back to an entrance before in his life, and he was doing it now. "I know," he said to the window. "Then understand that knowing isn't enough. Understanding isn't enough." She stood up again because the distance between them felt wrong. Not in a romantic way, in an honest way, in the way that a conversation this important shouldn't happen across a room. "What happens now? With Seong-won? What is the actual situation?" He turned from the window. His expression had reorganized into something more operational. The emotion filed back down somewhere underneath the surface where he apparently kept it. "He's moving to make a direct approach," Min-jae said. "I've been able to delay it. I've erased the most sensitive connections between you and the company from accessible records. But Seong-won has his own people, and eventually he'll locate you physically without needing my systems." A pause. "The man outside your building tonight is the 4th I've rotated through. They've been watching for anyone running surveillance on your building." "Have they seen anyone?" "Yes, 3 days ago. One of Seong-won's men." She let that land. 3 days ago," she repeated. "Yes. And you're telling me tonight. I was trying to..." Don't say manage it. Her voice came out sharper than she intended. Don't say you were managing it. He stopped. Outside, a car alarm started somewhere below, wailing briefly into the rain before cutting out. What do you need from me? She asked. The question surprised her slightly because it wasn't the question she'd expected to ask. She'd expected to ask him to leave. She'd expected to tell him that his problems were no longer her problems, that she'd done her part by surviving Daesung Global, and she had no intention of being dragged into the aftermath of whatever violent chess game he played with men like Cho Seung-won. But that wasn't what she asked. She asked what he needed, which meant she realized with a specific kind of exhausted clarity that somewhere in the last hour, she had moved from wanting him out of her apartment to accepting that sending him away without a plan was simply trading one danger for another. Min-jae was looking at her with an expression she'd seen perhaps twice in 3 years. It was the expression of a man who wasn't calculating his next move, just present, just human. I need you to let me explain the options, he said. Then explain them. He explained for an hour. She interrupted 12 times. He answered 11 of those interruptions directly and deflected the 12th, which was about the specific size and structure of the Black Viper Syndicate's operational network. And she let the deflection go because it was the one question she was probably better off not having answered in full. The options were temporary relocation, which she rejected immediately because leaving Seoul would mean abandoning the business registration, the client conversation she'd already begun, the 6 weeks of painstaking rebuilding she had clawed out of the wreckage of her resignation. There was increased security presence, which she would accept on the condition that she was informed of any changes in real time rather than 11 days after the fact. There was the possibility of a negotiated resolution with Seung-won. Min-jae's tone when he described this option made its viability clear. You don't think he'll negotiate, she said. He'll negotiate if he has no better alternative. At the moment, he believes he does. What changes that calculation? Min-jae looked at her carefully. That's the part I'm still working on. She studied him. There was something in the way he'd said that, careful, measured, with a specific quality of restraint, that told her the part he was still working on had dimensions he hadn't shared yet. You have a plan, she said. The outline of one. Does it resolve the situation? If it works, what are the risks? To you, minimal. To the operational landscape between Seung-won and my organization, significant. Significant how? He looked at her steadily. Significant in ways that are probably better discussed when I have more concrete information. It was not the most satisfying answer she'd ever received, but she had spent 3 years learning to read the difference between Kang Min-jae withholding information strategically and withholding it protectively, and this felt like the latter. Fine, she said. For now, I accept the security. On my terms. You tell me who, when, and why every single time anything changes. No more surprises. Agreed. And Min-jae? She waited until he met her eyes. If this situation escalates and you know about it before I do, you call me. Not in a week. Not after you've had time to manage it. Immediately. Something in his expression shifted. A softening so slight that most people would have missed it entirely. Understood, he said. He picked up his coat from the arm of the chair where he'd placed it when he came in. She walked him to the door. They stood in the narrow doorway the way they used to stand sometimes in conference room doors after late-night sessions, a particular in-between geography that was neither one room nor the other. You should go, she said. Yes. He didn't move immediately. Min-jae, I meant what I said on the phone, he said, when I called you 6 weeks ago. Her throat tightened slightly. She kept her face neutral. You called me exactly once in 6 weeks, and you said 3 sentences. Which 3 sentences are you referring to? You know which 3. She did know. She had replayed them approximately 400 times in the 6 weeks since, against her explicit and repeated instructions to her own brain. That conversation is separate from this one, she said. I know. Good. But it's not over. She held his gaze for a moment. That's also separate from this conversation, she said. Tonight we talked about Seung-won and security and operational logistics. That's what tonight was. Yes, Min-jae said. That's what tonight was. He left. She locked the door. She stood with her back against it for almost a minute, listening to the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, until the elevator doors opened and closed, and the building returned to its ordinary nighttime silence. Then she walked to her window and looked down at the street. The man in the shadow by the entrance was gone. She could see, if she angled her head right, a dark car idling half a block down. New position, same function. She stood there for a while watching the rain. She was still frightened. That hadn't changed. But the fear had different dimensions now, mapped more precisely against specific threats and specific people, which her brain found more manageable than vague dread. This was a problem with shape and edges, which meant it was theoretically solvable. What scared her more, what she spent the rest of that night lying awake trying not to examine too closely, was not Cho Seung-won. It was not the man outside her building, or the operational landscape of competing syndicates, or the 3 years of stored information inside her head that apparently made her valuable and dangerous in equal measure. What scared her was the answer to the question she hadn't asked out loud tonight. She had asked Min-jae what he needed. She had not asked herself the same question, and in the quiet of her apartment, rain still working at the windows, the outline of her consulting firm still open on her laptop screen, she was beginning to suspect that the honest answer was something she wasn't ready to say in any language. Downstairs, in the dark car half a block from her building, Kang Min-jae sat without moving. His phone showed 3 unread messages from operations contacts he hadn't answered. A 4th message from his second-in-command, Park Jun-ho, asking for confirmation on a logistics decision that needed resolution by morning. He read none of them. He was looking at the lit window on the 4th floor. Jun-ho's message buzzed again. Min-jae picked up the phone and typed a reply. Then he set it back down and looked at the window again for exactly 3 more seconds before starting the car. He drove 6 blocks before his phone rang. Private number. The kind that didn't stay private for people without very specific means of acquiring unlisted numbers. He accepted the call. Min-jae. The voice was smooth, conversational, carrying the particular warmth of a man who wanted to sound reasonable. It's been a while. Min-jae's hands were perfectly steady on the wheel. Seung-won, he said. I hear you paid a visit tonight. The woman in Mapogu. A pause. Nyla Adebayo. Interesting name for Seoul. Interesting person altogether. Another pause, longer, calibrated for effect. You know, I've been doing some reading about her. Very impressive. 3 years rebuilding Daesung's operational foundation from the inside without anyone realizing it was her doing most of the work. A soft sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Someone that smart, with that much institutional knowledge, sitting alone in an apartment in Mapogu. The warmth drained from his voice like water through a crack. Seems like an inefficient use of a valuable resource. Min-jae said nothing. I think we should talk, Seung-won said. About her. About what an arrangement might look like. Something that works for both of us. The lights of Seoul moved across the windshield. Red, gold, white. You'll want to think carefully, Min-jae said quietly, about what you say next. I already have. The warmth was gone entirely now. What replaced it was something cleaner and more honest. Have the conversation with me, Min-jae, or I have a different kind of conversation with her. Your choice. You have until Friday. The call ended. Min-jae drove 2 more blocks before pulling over. He sat with his hands on the wheel and the engine running, the Seoul night pressed against the car windows on every side. Friday was 4 days away. He had the outline of a plan. He needed the rest of it now. He picked up the phone and called Junho. I need a full profile on Cho Seung-won's Incheon operation, he said when the call connected. Assets, personnel, exposure points, everything current. By morning? By morning. He pulled back into traffic. 4 days. He had destroyed operations with less time and fewer resources. What made this one different? What made his hands not quite as steady as they'd been 30 seconds ago was not the complexity of the threat. It was the knowledge that for the first time in the careful, controlled, deliberately isolated life he had built, the most dangerous variable wasn't an enemy's capability or a logistical failure or a political complication. It was that he had stood in a small apartment in Mapogu with rain in his hair, and when Nyla Adebayo had looked at him and asked what he needed, He had almost said the wrong thing entirely. He hadn't. But the fact that he'd come close was information, and Cho Seung-won, somewhere in Incheon tonight, was already using it. Yoonho had the profile ready by 5:47 in the morning. Min-jae was already awake when the file came through, had been awake since 3. Sitting at the desk in his apartment on the 32nd floor of a building in Yeouido that officially belonged to a real estate holding company, watching the Han River go from black to gray to the particular colorless silver of very early Seoul morning. He'd slept 2 hours, maybe less. He hadn't been counting. He read through the profile twice without stopping. Cho Seung-won's Incheon operation was larger than Min-jae had allowed himself to fully acknowledge over the past 18 months of careful distance. 42 verified personnel in the port operation alone. 6 shell companies running parallel financial channels through 3 separate banks. Political connections in the Incheon Municipal Administration that went deeper than Min-jae had mapped. And a new partnership, recent, maybe 4 months old, with a logistics network out of Busan that doubled Seung-won's distribution capacity overnight. He had been growing while Min-jae was busy managing things quietly. The word management was starting to feel like a disease. Min-jae closed the file and called Junho back. "The Busan connection," he said. "How recent is that partnership?" 4 months, maybe 5. Junho's voice had the slightly compressed quality of a man who hadn't slept either. "It's clean on paper, a freight brokerage company, but the ownership structure has 2 layers of shell companies before you get to anything traceable. Someone helped him build that structure." "Yes." "Who?" A pause. "That's the part I don't have yet. I need another day." "You have until tonight." Min-jae stood from the desk and walked to the window. 32 floors down, the Han River was starting to catch the first gray light. "And Junho, the call last night, Seung-won knew exactly where I was. He knew I'd visited her." Junho was quiet for a moment. "That means he has someone close enough to track your movements in real time." "Yes." "Inside our operation. Or close to it. Find that too." He ended the call. He stood at the window for a while, watching the river. The thing about managing situations quietly, he was understanding with increasing clarity, was that quiet management created the illusion of control while the actual variables multiplied in the dark. He had been so focused on keeping Nyla invisible, erasing her name from systems, redirecting inquiries, placing watchers near her building without her knowledge, that he had failed to notice Seung-won wasn't just watching her. Seung-won was watching him watching her. Had been for months, probably. Mapping the pattern of Min-jae's protectiveness with the patience of a man who understood that the most reliable way to understand what someone valued was to observe what they protected without being asked. Min-jae had handed Seung-won the leverage himself. He pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose and held them there. This was the kind of mistake that happened when you started making decisions with something other than pure operational logic. He had known this for years, had built an entire behavioral architecture around knowing it, and still managed to walk straight into it. He got dressed, drank coffee he didn't taste, and left the apartment before 7. Nyla's morning started with a phone call from her mother. She'd been awake since 6, laptop open, running revised projections on the consulting firm's first quarter cost structure with the focused determination of someone using work as a structural substitute for the conversation she'd spent half the night replaying. She was good at this. She had been using work as a structural substitute for difficult emotions since approximately age 14, which her acrotherapist had very specific and clinical opinions about. Her mother's voice came through the phone warm and sharp in equal measure, the way it always did. "You sound tired." "Good morning to you too, Ma." That wasn't a criticism, it was an observation. "Are you sleeping?" "Enough." That means no. A pause filled with the particular weight of a mother who had raised a daughter who had been lying competently since childhood and was therefore undeceivable. "Is it the job situation?" "I'm working on the firm. The registration is moving." "That's not what I asked." Nyla closed her laptop and leaned back on the couch. Outside, the rain from last night had cleared into a pale, washed-out Seoul morning. She could see, if she looked at the right angle, the dark car that had replaced last night's dark car in approximately the same position half a block down. "There's a situation," she said. "What kind of situation?" "The complicated kind." "Nyla, It's manageable, Ma. There are people handling it. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a woman choosing her next words with surgical precision. What people? Her mother said. Nyla pressed her thumb and forefinger together in her lap. People from the company, former colleagues who are handling a complicated situation for you. Her mother's voice had shifted into a register Nyla recognized as the one she used when she was deciding how much alarm to express out loud. This has something to do with why you left that company. It wasn't a question. Ma, I promise you it's being handled. By who? By that man? Nyla went very still. What man? Don't do that. Don't go blank on me. You know exactly which man I'm talking about. You haven't said his name once in 6 weeks, which means you've been thinking about him every single day. A pause. Kang Min Jai, the one you were very careful never to describe as anything except your employer's son and your professional superior. Because that's what he was. Is that what he was? The pale morning light moved across the coffee table. Ma, Nyla said, I have to go. I have a call at 9. You don't have a call at 9. You're self-employed. I have a prospective client call. Nyla Adebayo. I'll call you this weekend. I love you. She ended the call before her mother could respond and sat for a moment with the phone face down in her lap, looking at the ceiling. Her mother was, infuriatingly, correct about most things. The call Min Jae had been dreading arrived at 9:15. He was in a car moving through Gangnam traffic when his phone showed the name he'd been expecting and not wanting to see, Kang Yong-soo. His father. The old man was officially retired. Had been for 3 years, ever since the health complications that Min Jae's official communications described as a cardiac event, and that were, in reality, the consequence of a business dispute that had gotten physical before Min Jae had been able to intervene. Kang Yong-soo lived in a compound outside Suwon, attended by security and medical staff and 2 very loyal people who had been with the family for decades, and he kept his distance from operational matters, except when he didn't. Min Jae accepted the call. I heard you have a problem with Cho Seong-won. His father's voice was rougher than it used to be. The health complications had left something permanent in his chest that occasionally showed up in his breathing. I heard it involves a woman. Where did you hear that? I hear things. That's not the relevant question. A brief pause occupied by the sound of his father shifting in a chair. The relevant question is what you intend to do about it, and whether you're going to let sentiment compromise your judgment. Min Jae watched a delivery motorcycle cut between 2 taxis on the street outside. I have a plan. A plan involving the woman. A plan involving Seong-won's operational exposure. The woman is... He stopped. She's a separate consideration. Nothing is a separate consideration when Seong-won is involved. He doesn't operate in separate considerations. He operates in unified pressure. His father coughed once. You've been protecting her for how long? That's not relevant to... How long, Min Jae? A pause. Since I understood the risk. 8, 9 months. And she didn't know. No. Another pause. Longer. So she's been walking around Seoul for 9 months, believing herself to be safe and independent while you moved pieces around her without her consent. His father's voice held no particular judgment. The old man was past judgment about operational choices, had seen too many of them. But the flatness of it was somehow worse. And now she knows. How did she take it? About as well as you'd expect. Meaning she's angry. Meaning she's right to be angry. A sound that in anyone else might have been surprise. In his father, it was just a recalibration. She's important to you. Father, I'm not criticizing. I'm establishing what the actual variables are. Another breath, slightly effortful. Seong-won will use that. He already is using it. You know this. Yes. Then you also know that a plan which accounts for your feelings about this woman is a weaker plan than one that doesn't. Min Jae said nothing. I'm not telling you to stop caring about her, his father said, with the specific precision of a man who had spent 68 years understanding that caring about things was not a variable you could simply remove. I'm telling you that Seong-won is going to put her in front of you and make you choose between her safety and the structural integrity of your operation. He is going to do this because he has correctly identified that you will choose her. And if you choose her without a plan that accounts for that choice, you will lose both. The car stopped at a light. Outside, two women walked past with coffee cups, talking and laughing, entirely unaware. I know, Min-jae said. Good. His father's voice shifted slightly. One more thing. The Busan connection Seong-won built. The logistics network. Min-jae went still. You know about that. I told you, I hear things. A pause. The person who built that structure for him, the financial architecture, you're not going to like who it is. Tell me. Lee Dae-hyun. The name landed in the car like something physical. Min-jae sat with it for 3 full seconds before he spoke. Lee Dae-hyun, he repeated. Your former director of operations, who resigned in anticipation of Daesung Global's audit exposure and apparently found a new patron quite quickly. His father paused. He knows everything about your operations' financial structure, and he knows everything about the woman because he spent 3 years working beside her and hating her for being better at his job than he was. The light changed. Min-jae's driver pulled into the intersection. He'll know what she knows, Min-jae said quietly. He'll know what she knows, and he'll know how to make Seong-won understand the value of it. Min-jae ended the call. He sat in the moving car with the Seoul morning sliding past the windows and reconstructed the entire situation with Lee Dae-hyun inserted into the architecture of it. Every piece rearranged. Seong-won hadn't come to the conclusion that Nyla was valuable leverage through independent analysis. He'd been guided there by a man who had watched her work for 3 years with the specific resentment of someone who understands they are inferior and cannot forgive the person who proves it daily. He called Junho again. Lee Dae-hyun, he said when the line connected. A brief silence. How did you find him? Exactly where he is and exactly what he's told Seong-won by noon. He hung up. Nyla's prospective client call was actually real. A mid-sized pharmaceutical distribution company whose operations director had found her through a former Daesung contact. And she handled it with the disciplined competence that was, at this point, basically a reflex. 40 minutes, precise analysis of their current distribution bottleneck. A clear outline of what restructured logistics management could do for their Q4 numbers. The operations director sounded impressed. He said he'd loop in his CEO for a follow-up meeting next week. She ended the call and sat for a moment in the ordinary satisfaction of being good at something. Then her phone showed Min-jae's name and the satisfaction evaporated. It's 10 in the morning, she said when she answered. I know, I need to tell you something before you hear it another way. His voice was careful in a specific way that meant the information was bad. She set her coffee mug down. Tell me. Lee Dae-hyun is connected to Seong-won's operation. The name hit her the way she imagined a slap would. A sudden sharp contact that left you briefly unable to organize your thoughts around anything except the fact that it had happened. Lee Dae-hyun, the man who had presented her work to a boardroom full of executives while she sat outside the closed door listening to them applaud his insight. The man who had told her once, in the particular quiet of an empty corridor, that her problem was that she expected to be treated as if her presence was an asset rather than an accommodation. Who had smiled at her in meetings in the specific way that was designed to make her feel the smile was a gift she should appreciate. How connected, she said. He built the financial structure that's expanding Seong-won's operation into Busan. He's been working with him since approximately 6 weeks after Daesung's audit exposure began. 6 weeks. She stood up. Her body needed to be moving. That's right after I left. Yes. He blamed me. He blamed me for the audit. She walked to the window. Min-jae, the audit started because I left, and 3 weeks later the financial irregularities I'd been quietly organizing and cross-referencing for 2 years became visible to the external auditors. He knew that. He knew that I knew, and he's told Seong-won enough about you to make Seong-won understand exactly how to use you, Min-jae said. Not just as leverage against me, as a source. I don't have access to any systems. I resigned. What you have is in your head. A pause. You spent 3 years inside the operational structure of Daesung Global. You saw financial records, you cross-referenced accounts, You understand the architecture of how money moved through that company, including the parts of it that Lee Dae-hyun and others were using for their own purposes. His voice was very controlled. Seung-won has been told that you could, if pressed, reconstruct enough of that architecture from memory to expose a significant number of people. Nyla stared at the pale morning outside the window. Could you? Min-jae asked quietly. She breathed in through her nose. Yes, she said. A silence that felt like it had weight. I wasn't planning to, she said. I left. I just wanted to leave. I know. But yes, I could. She pressed her palm flat against the window glass. It was cold from the night's rain. He knows I could. Dae-hyun knows I could. Yes. She thought about Lee Dae-hyun's face in that corridor, the smile, the particular pleasure he'd taken in small cruelties delivered in quiet spaces where no one could witness them except her. She had written him off as a mediocre man, elevated by a system designed to elevate mediocre men who reminded other mediocre men of themselves. She had not, apparently, written him off as someone capable of walking out of a dissolving corporation and immediately finding his way into organized crime infrastructure. He hates me, she said. Yes. Not because I did anything to him, because I existed in a space he believed was his, and I was better at what he was supposed to be doing. Yes. And now he's told a criminal operation that I'm a liability. Or an asset, depending on what you'd agree to. Min-jae's voice had gone very quiet. Seung-won's call last night, he called it an arrangement, something that works for both of us. Nyla turned from the window. He wants me to give him information. That's my read. And if I don't? Min-jae didn't answer immediately. The silence was its own answer. Friday, she said. He gave you until Friday. Yes. She stood in the middle of her apartment, the apartment she had chosen herself, filled with things she'd chosen herself, the Insadong watercolor and the consulting firm outline, and the 3 weeks of careful rebuilding, and felt the walls of her carefully reconstructed independence pressing inward. I'm not giving him information, she said. The words came out quieter than she intended, but without any uncertainty in them. Not under any circumstance. I don't care what the alternative is. That is not something I will do. I know, Min-jae said. I'm not asking you to. What are you asking me? I'm asking you to trust me for 4 days. She almost laughed, not with amusement, with the specific exhaustion of a woman who had spent 3 years trusting this man in the form of believing he was fundamentally decent while watching him fail to act like it in any of the ways that mattered. Trust you, she said. I know what that sounds like. Do you? Do you understand what you're asking when you say that to me specifically? Her voice was controlled, but barely. You had 9 months to tell me I was in danger. You chose silence and called it protection. And now you're asking me for 4 days of trust. Yes. His voice didn't waver. Because I don't have a better word for what I need from you. I need you to stay visible enough that Seung-won believes I'm complying with his timeline while I build the case that ends his operation before Friday. And I need you to do that without telling you every detail of how I'm building it. Because some of those details are things you're safer not knowing. A pause. I'm asking you for trust while admitting I haven't earned it. I understand what that is. She stared at the consulting firm outline on her laptop screen, the neat columns, the revenue projections, the name she'd already chosen for the company. If anything happens without you telling me in advance, she said, we're done. Not just whatever this is between us. All of it. I will take everything I know about Daesung's financial architecture and I will hand it to the Financial Services Commission myself. Every account, every irregularity, everything. She paused. Including whatever connects to your operation. The silence was longer than she expected. Understood, he said. I'm not bluffing. I know you're not. Something in his voice shifted slightly. That's what makes it a reasonable threat. She almost said something else. She stopped herself. 4 days, she said. Call me tonight. She ended the call. She stood there for a moment in the apartment's mid-morning quiet, the pale soul light coming through the window, the dark car still visible half a block down, and understood with complete clarity that she had just agreed to something she could not fully see the edges of. That she was standing at a point past which the previous 6 weeks, the careful rebuilding, the rice and gochujang, and thinking about nothing important, would not be recoverable in the same form. She opened her laptop and went back to the consulting firm projections. She stared at the numbers. She changed two figures that had been bothering her for a week. At 11:43, her phone rang again. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer it. Something made her. Miss Adebayo. The voice was smooth, cultivated, unhurried. The voice of a man who had decided time was something he could spend however he chose. I think we've both been patient long enough. It's time to have an honest conversation. She went very still. Cho Seung-won, she said. I'm glad Min-jae described me. It saves the introductions. A brief pause. I want you to know that nothing about this is personal. You're an intelligent woman who ended up in an inconvenient position. I'd like to help you find a more comfortable one. By comfortable, you mean useful to you. By comfortable, I mean safe, stable, well compensated. He let that sit for a moment. I understand you're building a consulting firm. That's admirable. Independent women building independent businesses, I find that genuinely impressive. I'd like to see you succeed at it. I'm going to succeed at it regardless of this conversation. I hope that's true. The warmth in his voice thinned by a precise calibrated degree. I want to meet with you, tomorrow, somewhere neutral and public of your choosing, just a conversation. I don't have anything to say to you. You might, once you understand the full picture of your situation. A pause. Min-jae is a capable man, but he has interests that aren't always identical to yours. You spent 3 years learning that the hard way. He paused again, letting it land. I'm simply suggesting that before you spend 4 more days trusting someone who has a history of protecting you in ways you didn't know about and didn't consent to, you might want to hear a different perspective. Her hand was completely steady on the phone. She was actually somewhat proud of that. I'll think about it, she said. That's all I ask. The call ended. She set the phone face down on the desk. She sat for 10 seconds, then she picked it back up and called Min-jae. He answered on the second ring. Seung-won just called me directly, she said. He wants a meeting tomorrow. The pause on his end was brief and hard. How did he get your number? Lee Dae-hyun, she said. Obviously. Another pause. Don't meet with him, Min-jae said. I know. She stopped. Min-jae, he said something about how your interests aren't always identical to mine, about the way you protect people without their knowledge or consent. Her voice was even, careful. He knew exactly what to say, which means he's been briefed on the specific architecture of what's between us. He knows where the fracture lines are. Yes, which means Dae-hyun didn't just tell him about my professional knowledge. He told him about us. Yes, everything. A pause that contained more than 3 years of careful omissions. Yes, Min-jae said quietly. Everything. She breathed out slowly. Then he knows, she said, that the question isn't whether you'll choose me over your operation. He's already assumed that answer. The question he's actually testing is whether I'll choose you. The silence that followed was the stillest one yet, and in it, Nyla understood with the particular awful clarity of a very intelligent woman who had just been outmaneuvered on 2 fronts simultaneously that the 4 days she'd agreed to were not going to be enough. Because Cho Seung-won hadn't called to make her an offer, he'd called to make sure Min-jae knew he had. Min-jae didn't say anything for almost 8 seconds after Nyla spoke. She counted them. Not consciously, just the way you count things when you're waiting for a response that matters, when the silence has texture and weight, and you need something to do with the part of your brain that isn't focused on staying completely still. Where are you right now? He said finally. My apartment, where I've been all morning. Don't leave. His voice had shifted into the operational register she recognized. Flat, precise, stripped of everything except function. Don't answer any more unknown numbers. I'll be there in 40 minutes. You don't need to. 40 minutes. He ended the call. Nyla set the phone on the desk and looked at it for a moment. Then she got up, went to the kitchen, and made fresh coffee she actually intended to drink this time. Her hands were steady. She observed this with clinical detachment, the particular composure of a woman who had learned early that falling apart was a luxury with a very high cost, and that the bill always came at the worst possible time. Seung-won had called her directly. He had her number. She stood at the kitchen counter while the coffee brewed and walked backward through every person who had her personal number from her Daesung Global years. It wasn't a long list. She had been careful, professionally careful, the kind of careful that comes from understanding instinctively that in certain environments, the less access people have to you, the safer you are. Her direct line, her email, a handful of colleagues she had trusted enough to build actual working relationships with. Lee Dae-hyun had never been one of them, but he had been her direct superior for 14 months of her 3 years at Daesung Global, and access to her contact information would not have required him to ask her for it. It would have required him to look at a company directory, which was not, in any operational sense, a significant barrier. She poured the coffee. She thought about the way Seong-won had talked, the warmth that was calibrated rather than genuine, the pauses placed with the precision of someone who had been told exactly which pressure points to find. He hadn't been improvising. He had been executing a prepared approach, and the preparation had been thorough. He knew about the consulting firm. He knew about the specific quality of her relationship with Min Jae, not just the professional surface of it, but the fault lines underneath, the history of silences and omissions and protections that hadn't felt like protections from the inside. Lee Dae-hyun had briefed him on all of it. The man who had stolen her work and smiled while doing it had spent the past 6 weeks constructing a detailed portrait of her vulnerabilities for a criminal operator in Incheon. She drank the coffee. It was good. She had learned to make good coffee in Seoul, which was one of approximately 7 things she would genuinely miss about the city if she ever left it, which she was not planning to do. She was not planning to be driven out of a life she had built herself by a man who had been using her work as his own business card for 3 years, and had apparently decided that wasn't sufficient damage. So, Min Jae arrived in 37 minutes, which meant he had driven fast. She opened the door before he knocked. She'd heard the elevator, and looked at him in the hallway. He was in a dark jacket over a gray shirt, no tie, and he looked like he'd spent the morning doing the same kind of not sleeping she had. He was holding his phone in one hand, and there was a quality to his stillness that was different from his usual controlled composure. It was the stillness of something that had been moving very fast and had just stopped. "Come in," she said. He came in. He didn't sit. He stood in the center of her living room and looked at her with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously, none of which he appeared to be fully in control of. "He has your number," Min Jae said. "Yes, we established that." That means Dae-hyun gave him more than operational information. He gave him your personal contacts, which means he went through whatever he had access to from his time at Daesung and compiled everything that could be useful, Nyla said. "Yes, I got there too." She sat on the couch. "Sit down. You're making the room feel smaller." He sat, not in the chair this time, on the other end of the couch, which was a small shift in geography that meant something she filed away without examining. "Junho found Dae-hyun," Min Jae said. "He's in Incheon, has been for 5 weeks. He's been working directly with Seong-won's operation as a financial consultant. That's the official description." His jaw tightened slightly. "He's been thorough. What he's given Seong-won is not just your contact information and personal background. It's a functional dossier. Your professional capabilities, your specific knowledge of Daesung's financial architecture, your relationship patterns." He paused. "Your family contacts, your mother's name and address in Accra." The coffee cup in her hand went very still. "Her address," Nyla said. "It's in the dossier. Junho confirmed it this morning." She set the coffee cup on the table carefully. She placed it in the exact center of the coaster. She kept her eyes on it for 3 seconds while she processed what her nervous system was trying to do, which was something she couldn't permit it to do right now. "He included my mother," she said. "Yes." "As what?" "As leverage. As a variable. He included everyone who might constitute leverage." Min Jae's voice was very quiet. "Her address is in there alongside yours. I've already made contact with a security firm in Accra. They're discreet and they're reliable. Your mother won't know they're there." Nyla looked up from the coffee cup. "You already arranged that," she said. "This morning, before I called you. Without asking me." The words came out the same way the others had. Not as accusation exactly, just as fact. The pattern had a shape now, a recurring geometry she could trace with her eyes closed. Min-jae's version of care was preemptive and unilateral and structurally indistinguishable from control. Yes, he said, without asking you. Because the threat was immediate, and asking you would have taken time, and he stopped. He pressed his mouth together briefly. And I did it because it was faster, and I knew it was wrong, and I'm telling you about it now because I said I would. She looked at him. Thank you for telling me, she said. It came out more complicated than she intended. He held her gaze for a moment, then he looked away. The plan I had, he said, the outline I told you about, it's no longer sufficient. Why? Because it depended on Seong-won not making direct contact with you before Friday. He moved the timeline. Calling you this morning was a message to me. He's telling me that the distance I've been operating from is gone. He can reach you directly. He just demonstrated it. Min-jae's hands were resting on his knees, very still. The plan I had was designed to dismantle his Incheon operation through financial exposure. Use the information Junho compiled about his account structures and the shell companies to create enough legal pressure to force him to withdraw. Quiet, clean. Nobody gets hurt. But Daehyun has anticipated that. He knows how I operate. He spent 2 years watching me manage Daesung Global's cleaner financial channels. He's built Seong-won's account structure specifically to withstand the kind of exposure strategy I would use. He paused. The financial architecture he built for Seong-won in Busan mirrors the defensive structures we use in our own operation. He built it as a mirror deliberately, so that any legal action against Seong-won's finances creates equal exposure for mine. Nyla went very still. He built it to implicate you, she said. Yes. If you go after Seong-won financially, we both go down, or we both stay standing. His voice was completely flat. He gave Seong-won a nuclear option. If I force the issue, Seong-won detonates the financial structure and takes both operations into the exposure zone simultaneously. It doesn't destroy either of us. The legal complications would take years to resolve. But it destabilizes everything long enough for the balance of power in the city to shift. He met her eyes. Seong-won doesn't need to win. He just needs me to lose enough ground that he can fill the space. Nyla stood up. She walked to the window. Outside, Seoul was having the kind of ordinary Tuesday that cities have regardless of what is happening inside specific apartments, traffic and commerce, and people buying lunch, and none of it touching any of this. So your plan is gone, she said. The plan I had is gone. And Daehyun built the thing that destroyed it. Yes. She turned around. How long have you known about the mirror structure? About what he built? Min-jae held her gaze. Junho confirmed it 40 minutes ago. That's not what I asked. How long have you suspected it? A pause. 3 days, he said. The room was quiet. 3 days, Nyla repeated. You suspected for 3 days that your plan had been neutralized, and you didn't tell me. I didn't have confirmation. You suspected. You knew there was a significant probability that the strategy you described to me as viable was not viable, and you didn't tell me. I asked you for immediate information. I specifically said, she stopped herself, breathed. I specifically said, call me immediately if anything changes. And you sat on 3 days of suspicion because you were waiting for confirmation. Min-jae stood up. Yes, he said, I did. Because telling you an unconfirmed suspicion would have what? Frightened me? Given me information I might have used to make my own decisions about my own situation? Her voice was not raised. It was the opposite of raised. It had dropped into a register that was somehow harder to hear than shouting. Min-jae, do you understand what you just told me? You looked me in the face last night and made me a promise. And 3 days before that, you already had reason to believe the thing you were promising me was built on sand. And you said nothing. I was trying to solve it before I found out. She looked at him. That's what you were doing. You were trying to solve the problem before I found out, so that I never had to know there was a problem. Which is exactly what you have been doing for 9 months. Her voice was perfectly level. This is not new. This is the same thing. You dressed it up differently each time, but the core of it is the same. You make decisions about information that belongs to my life, about my safety, about my choices, and you decide what I should know and when, and you call it protection. She stopped. It is not protection. It is management, and I am not a situation to be managed. He didn't flinch. He stood there and took it because it was true. And he knew it was true, and that was perhaps the most maddening thing, that he was capable of understanding exactly what she was saying and still being constitutionally unable to have done it differently. "You're right," he said. "Stop saying that." "I can't stop saying it when you're right. It doesn't change anything when you say it after the fact." She pressed her fingers to her forehead. "What do we do now?" "Forget the feelings for 1 minute. Operationally, what do we do?" He was quiet for a moment. Something shifted in him. She watched it happen. The emotion filed back down and the operational structure coming up underneath it. The same gear change she'd observed in boardrooms and late-night calls and once in a corridor when someone had said something threatening in what they believed was an empty hallway. "I need to go directly at Seong-won," he said. "Not financially, politically. He has municipal connections in Incheon, but they're not clean. They were bought, and bought connections are connections with a price attached that someone else can pay. I have relationships with people at the national prosecution level who have been watching Incheon's port administration for 2 years. He paused. If I move those relationships now, accelerate the timeline on an investigation that was already building, I can create enough pressure on Seong-won's political infrastructure to force him to consolidate, pull back from the Busan expansion, protect his core operation, stop devoting resources to you as leverage. How long does that take? Moving the prosecution relationship, 2 days if it goes cleanly. Does it go cleanly? Not always. She looked at him. And Dae-hyun, his mirror structure, that still exists even if you pull this off. Yes, that's a separate problem with a longer timeline. What's the separate problem's solution? Min-jae hesitated. It was a very small hesitation. She would have missed it 2 years ago. She didn't miss it now. "What are you not telling me?" she said. "Nyla." "What?" "Are you not telling me?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "The financial mirror structure Dae-hyun built. There's only one way to dismantle it cleanly without both operations going into exposure. Someone with direct knowledge of Daesung Global's original financial architecture, who can demonstrate the pre-existing structure that Dae-hyun copied, can provide the documentation that distinguishes my operation's legitimate channels from the ones he mirrored." The apartment was very quiet. "Someone," Nyla said slowly, "with direct knowledge." Min-jae said nothing. "You mean me?" The words came out flat. "The person who can dismantle the thing Dae-hyun built to destroy you is me, because I'm the one who built the original architecture that he copied." Still nothing. "Kang Min-jae." Her voice was very careful. "Please tell me that you did not come to my apartment last night and build a case for me trusting you while knowing that the resolution of your problem ultimately required my direct involvement. I didn't know the extent of what Dae-hyun built when I came last night. But you knew your operation was exposed. You knew there was a financial vulnerability. And you knew that I was the person with the most direct knowledge of Daesung's original financial structure." She took a step toward him, not aggressive, just removing the distance that felt dishonest given the conversation they were having. "You knew that when you knocked on my door." He met her eyes. "Yes," he said. The word was quiet and absolute, and it landed in the room like the last piece of a structure finally revealing its real shape. She had built the thing he needed to save himself. She had spent 3 years building it, while people like Lee Dae-hyun put their names on her work. And now the shadow of that work had followed her out of the building, out of the corporate life, out of the 6 weeks of careful reconstruction, all the way to her apartment door at 11 at night in the rain. She turned away from him. She walked to the kitchen. She stood at the counter and gripped the edge of it with both hands, looking at the coffee maker, the cabinet doors, the ordinary geography of her kitchen that had nothing to do with any of this. "Get out," she said. "Nyla, I need you to leave my apartment right now. If I leave without, I am not asking you to solve anything right now. I am telling you that I need you to not be in this room." Her voice was completely controlled and she was gripping the counter hard enough that her knuckles were uncomfortable. "You can text me whatever operational logistics require my attention, but I need you to leave." She heard him behind her, the sound of movement. She didn't turn around. "I'll have Junho send updated security information to your phone," he said quietly. "The man outside is being replaced in an hour." His name is Song Tae-young. He'll text you when he's in position." She didn't respond. She heard him cross the living room. She heard the door open. "I'm sorry," he said. Not in the calculated way, in the other way. The way she'd heard from him exactly twice in 3 years, each time in an empty room with no audience. Not as a strategy, just, "I'm sorry." The door closed. She stood at the kitchen counter and breathed. She gave herself 20 minutes. This was a rule she had developed sometime in her mid-20s, when she understood that she was the kind of person whose emotional processing happened on a delay. The crisis would pass, and she'd function through it. And then 20 minutes later, in a quiet room, the actual weight of it would arrive. So she had learned to schedule the 20 minutes rather than fight them. She sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet and her knees up, and she went through it properly. The anger, which was clean and justified and pointed in several specific directions simultaneously. The underneath of the anger, which was more complicated and which she was not ready to name all the way. The question of what she was going to do about the fact that 3 years of her professional life had been architecturally duplicated and weaponized by a man who had spent those years taking credit for her existence while resenting it. At minute 17, her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Unknown number. Different from this morning's. She stared at it. She answered, "Ms. Adebayo." Not Seung-won's voice. A different one. Younger, less polished, with the specific flatness of someone delivering a prepared message. "Mr. Cho asks that you check your email." The call ended. She got up from the kitchen floor. She opened her laptop. There was a new email from an address she didn't recognize, no subject line. She opened it. It contained 2 attachments and 4 sentences. The 4 sentences informed her that the security arrangement Min Jae had described, the rotating watchers, Song Tae-young, the car half a block from her building, had been identified and compromised by Seung-won's people 20 minutes ago. That the man currently in position outside her building was not Song Tae-young. That the first attachment was a photograph confirming this, which she opened and looked at and understood immediately was genuine. And that the second attachment was a document she should review before making any decisions about whose protection she was relying on. She opened the second attachment. It was a financial document, 41 pages, dense with account numbers and transaction records and structural diagrams. She recognized the formatting. She'd used similar formats herself for Daesung Global's internal audits. She read the first 10 pages with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what they were looking at. By page 6, she had stopped breathing normally. By page 9, she was standing up without remembering deciding to stand. By page 10, she sat back down. Because what the document showed, what it demonstrated with the clean and different clarity of financial records, was that the account structure Min Jae had described as his operation's legitimate channels was not, in several significant cases, what he had told her it was. That certain financial flows she had believed, based on what he'd told her last night, and this morning, were clean and distinct from Daesung Global's irregularities, were not distinct at all. That they were connected, had been connected for at least 2 years, to 3 specific accounts she had personally flagged and cross-referenced during her time at Daesung Global. Accounts that, according to the records she had quietly, carefully, never quite consciously compiled over 3 years, were used to move money that did not have a clean explanation. The document Seung-won had just sent her was saying, with 41 pages of support, that Min Jae had known about those accounts, that he had not just been adjacent to the corruption at Daesung Global, that he had been, in specific and documented instances, a participant in it. She closed the laptop. She opened it again. She went back to page 3, which contained the earliest transaction records, and she read the dates. She read the account numbers. She pulled up the mental map she had built over 3 years of cross-referencing Daesung's finances. The map she had never shown to anyone, never documented officially, just carried in her head like a structure that had assembled itself without her permission. And she matched the numbers against it. Some of them matched. Not all. Not even most. But enough. Her phone was in her hand. She had Min Jae's number on the screen. Her thumb was on the call button and had been for approximately 30 seconds while she sat in the specific paralysis of a woman who understood that the call she was about to make could not be unmade and that the answer she received would restructure everything that had happened in the past 48 hours into a completely different shape. She pressed call. He answered immediately. The email Seung-won just sent me, she said, and her voice was the steadiest it had been all day, which was the composure of someone who has moved past fear into something colder. The financial document, 41 pages, account records from 2021 and 2022. She paused for exactly 1 second. Tell me it's fabricated. The silence on his end was 3 seconds long. She had been counting, and 3 seconds from Kang Min-jae was not the silence of a man about to deny something. 3 seconds from Min-jae was the silence of a man deciding how much of the truth to give her and in what order, and how to frame the part that was going to damage him most. And she had spent 3 years learning to read his silences, and this one was 3 seconds. She had counted them, and she knew what they meant, and she waited anyway, because some part of her was still holding space for the possibility that she was wrong about what those 3 seconds contained. It's not fabricated, Min-jae said. The apartment didn't change. The light was the same pale Tuesday light. The coffee cup was still in the exact center of the coaster. The consulting firm outline was still open on her laptop screen beside the 41 pages that had just restructured the last 3 years of her life. Tell me what it is, she said. Those accounts. He stopped. Started again. In 2021, Daesung Global was hemorrhaging from 3 failed infrastructure contracts in Vietnam. The kind of loss that creates cascading failures, suppliers, payroll, operational continuity. My father had been out of active management for 6 months. The board was making decisions in panic mode. 2 directors were quietly moving assets offshore in anticipation of a controlled collapse. A pause. I moved money through those accounts to stabilize the operational channels. Bridge financing. It was not documented through official channels, because documenting it officially would have triggered regulatory review at a moment when the company could not survive regulatory review. You used accounts that were already irregular. I used accounts that had the structural flexibility to move quickly. Yes, structural flexibility. The phrase tasted the way it deserved to. You laundered stabilization funds through irregular accounts to keep the company operational. That's one way to describe it. Is there another way that's more accurate? Silence. No, he said. She closed the laptop, opened it again. She needed to do something with her hands. And Dae-hyun knew. He was still operations director. He would have seen the account movement. At the time, I assessed that he was compromised enough himself that mutual exposure created sufficient deterrence. His voice was flat and technical, and she understood he was doing the same thing she was, using operational language as structural support, a framework to hold the conversation together while the actual weight of it pressed down from every direction. I was wrong about that, obviously. Obviously? She stood up and walked to the window. The street below was the same street. The position where Song Tae-yang was supposed to be was occupied by someone she now understood was not Song Tae-yang. Does your actual security detail know their man has been replaced? I'm already handling it. His voice sharpened. Nyla, where are you exactly in the apartment? Kitchen window. Why? Move away from the window. She moved. Not quickly, deliberately, without the appearance of urgency, because she was still angry enough that complying with his instructions felt like a minor concession she was making for practical reasons rather than because she trusted his judgment. I'm in the hallway, she said. The man outside is not armed. He's surveillance. He's there to report your movements, not to approach you. A pause. Seung-won is not going to move on you physically before our Friday deadline. The email was a demonstration. He wants you frightened and distrustful of me before the meeting he proposed. He succeeded on both counts. Her voice was very even. A beat of silence. I know, Min-jae said. I need you to answer me something directly. No strategic framing, no deciding what I need to know. She leaned her shoulder against the hallway wall. Those accounts, the financial structure Dae-hyun copied for Seung-won, does the documentation he has create actual legal exposure for you? Real exposure, not theoretical. Yes. How serious? Serious enough that a prosecutor with the right motivation could build a case that would take 2 to 3 years to resolve and would suspend most of my operational capacity in the interim. And Seung-won has a prosecutor. He has a relationship with one, in Incheon. Whether it extends to national prosecution level is the question I've been trying to answer for 48 hours. If it does, Then the political pressure strategy I described is gone too, because the prosecutor relationship I was going to leverage cuts both ways if Seong-won has already been there first. She let out a breath through her nose, slow and controlled. Everything he had described as his plan was contingent on variables he hadn't confirmed. The financial strategy was neutralized by the mirror structure. The political strategy was contingent on whether Seong-won had already compromised the prosecution relationship. The security arrangement had just been visibly penetrated outside her building. The outline of a plan. That was what he'd called it. She understood now that the outline was all there had ever been. "I need an hour," she said. "Nyla, an hour. Don't call me. Don't send Junho. Don't arrange anything that involves me without telling me first." She pushed off the wall. "I'll call you in an hour." She ended the call before he could respond. What? She spent the hour doing the things she was actually good at. She opened the laptop. She opened the 41-page document and she read all of it, this time slowly, with the same systematic attention she'd applied to 3 years of Daesung Global's financial chaos. She built a mental map of the mirror structure Dae-hyun had created, where it was strong, where it was defensive, where its defensive strength was actually its vulnerability, because structures built to deflect attack from one direction are, by definition, open from another. She thought about what she knew, not what she'd been told, what she actually knew from 3 years inside the original architecture. By minute 40, she had the shape of something. By minute 55, she was on the phone. Not with Min Jae, with a woman named Ji Yeon, who had been a junior analyst at Daesung Global for Nyla's first 2 years and who had left the company 8 months before Nyla did to take a position at a mid-tier financial regulatory consultancy. Ji Yeon had been one of perhaps 4 people at Daesung Global whom Nyla had trusted enough to occasionally have lunch with. She was precise, quiet, and had a memory for account structures that rivaled Nyla's own. "I need to meet with you today," Nyla said when Ji Yeon answered. "Not here. Somewhere you choose." A pause. "Is everything okay?" "No, but it will be. Can you meet in 2 hours?" Another pause. "Yes." She texted Min Jae. "I need a different security arrangement for the next 4 hours. Someone I haven't met. Someone Seong-won doesn't have a profile on. Can you do that?" His response came in 40 seconds. "Yes." "Name is Han Byul, woman. She'll be at your door in 20 minutes. She doesn't work for my organization. She's independent, contracted today only. I'll send her photo." The photo arrived. A woman in her late 30s, angular face, the particular alert stillness of someone who had been trained for exactly this kind of work. "Thank you," Nyla typed. She stared at those 2 words for a moment. Then she sent them anyway. What? Han Byul was at her door in 18 minutes. She was exactly as she appeared in the photograph, economical, watchful, communicating availability without performing it. She told Nyla her protocols in 4 sentences and asked no questions about the situation. She was, Nyla thought, the most professionally satisfying person she had encountered in the past 48 hours. They took a route to the cafe Ji Yeon had chosen in Hongdae that involved 2 subway transfers and a 12-minute walk. And Han Byul managed all of it with the low-profile competence of someone doing their job rather than demonstrating it. Ji Yeon was already at the corner table when they arrived, a coffee in front of her, her expression calibrated to careful neutrality in the way of someone who had assessed the situation in the 14 seconds between arriving and seeing Nyla walk through the door. "You look like you haven't slept," Ji Yeon said. "I haven't." Nyla sat down. "What I'm about to tell you stays in this table. What I'm about to ask you stays in this table. If at any point you want to leave, leave. I mean that." Ji Yeon wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Tell me." Nyla told her. Stripped of the personal elements, stripped of Min Jae's voice in her hallway and the rain on his coat and the 3 years of watching him watch her, but with the full financial and operational architecture laid out precisely. The mirror structure. The account records from 2021, the 41 pages. What she needed. Ji Yeon listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Nyla had always valued about her. When Nyla finished, Ji Yeon was quiet for a moment. She turned her coffee cup a quarter rotation, then another. "You want to build a counter-document," Ji Yeon said, "using the original Daesung architecture to demonstrate the pre-existing irregularities that the mirror structure is based on." Establish provenance. Show that the accounts were already irregular before the 2021 transactions, that the bridge financing Min Jae ran through them was a secondary layer rather than the origin of the problem. It doesn't excuse what he did, no, but it contextualizes it in a way that changes the legal exposure timeline significantly. Ji-yeon looked at her directly. You're not doing this to protect him. I'm doing it to give myself a functional piece on the board, Nyla said. Something I control. Something that isn't a reaction to whatever move Seong-won makes next. She paused. I'm also doing it because the original irregularities at Daesung Global were built and maintained by Lee Dae-hyun and 3 other executives for at least 4 years before Min Jae's 2021 transactions. And I spent 3 years building the documentation of that, privately, without telling anyone, because I didn't know what else to do with it. She met Ji-yeon's eyes. It's time to do something with it. Ji-yeon turned her coffee cup 1 more quarter rotation. A full circle completed. I still have access to 2 external account verification platforms from the consultancy, she said carefully. I can corroborate structure and timeline without accessing anything I'm not authorized to access. That's all I need. When? Tonight. Can you work tonight? Yes. Ji-yeon looked at her steadily. Nyla, what happens to you after this? I don't know yet, Nyla said honestly, but I'm going to be the one who decides it. So, she called Min Jae at 4 in the afternoon from the back seat of a car Han Byul had arranged, moving through Mapogu traffic toward her apartment. I need a meeting, she said. You, me, and whoever you trust most in your operation. Tonight. My terms, my location. I have something that changes the shape of what we can do. A pause. What have you built? A counter document. The provenance of the original account irregularities at Daesung Global. It establishes that the 2021 transactions you ran were a secondary layer on an already compromised structure. It doesn't exonerate you, but it significantly complicates Seung-won's ability to use those records as a clean weapon. Silence. Ji-yeon, he said quietly. Not a question. Yes. You trust her. I trust my own judgment about who to trust, which is more than I can say for several recent decisions in my vicinity. The words came out sharper than she intended, and she didn't soften them. Can you get your people here by 8? Yes. And Min Jae? She looked out the window at the city moving past. Bring everything Junho has on Seong-won's prosecution relationship. I need to know if that door is open or closed before I decide how to use what I have. I'll have it. 8 o'clock. She ended the call. She sat back in the seat and watched Seoul go past the windows. The bridges and the apartment towers and the Han River briefly visible between buildings like a gray ribbon. And she felt the particular clarity of a person who has stopped waiting for circumstances to resolve and started moving the pieces themselves. It was not comfortable clarity. It had sharp edges. But it was hers. They arrived at 8 o'clock exactly. Min Jae. Junho, whom she was meeting for the first time, compact, careful, with the energy of someone perpetually processing more information than he displayed. And a third man she didn't recognize, who was introduced only as Wu, and who sat against the wall and said nothing for the entire meeting, and whose function she understood to be witnessing. Ji-yeon was already there, laptop open, the counter document structured and cross-referenced and ready for exactly this. Nyla's apartment had never contained this many people or this much unspoken weight simultaneously, and it showed. The space reorganized itself around the density of it, the small living room suddenly feeling like a room where actual things were decided. Nyla stood. She did not pace. She stood in the center of her own apartment, and she presented what she and Ji-yeon had built with the same direct precision she'd used in every high-stakes presentation she'd ever delivered. The ones where her name disappeared from the slide deck 5 minutes before she walked into the room. Her name was not disappearing from anything tonight. The counter document demonstrated 3 things. First, the accounts Min Jae had used in 2021 had been running irregular transactions since 2018, 2 years before he'd ever touched them. Second, the primary architects of those irregularities were Lee Dae-hyun and 2 senior directors who had since resigned. Third, the mirror structure Dae-hyun had built for Seong-won in Busan had been constructed using internal Daesung documentation that Dai Hyun had no authorization to retain after his resignation, making its creation a criminal act independent of anything it was being used to accomplish. Yoonho looked at the document for 4 minutes without speaking. "This changes the prosecution angle," he said finally. "If Seongwon's prosecutor moves on the 2021 accounts, this is the counterfiling. It expands the investigation to include Dai Hyun's document theft and Seongwon's use of stolen proprietary records. It turns a targeted action into a bilateral exposure situation." "Meaning Seongwon detonates his weapon and it blows up in his direction too," Nyla said. "Yes." Junho looked at Min-jae. "The prosecution contact you have at the national level. Is he clean?" "Completely," Min-jae said. He had been looking at Nyla for most of the presentation with an expression she was deliberately not examining in detail. "Then we file the counter-documentation preemptively. Before Friday. Before Seongwon moves." Junho looked back at the screen. "We don't wait for him to swing. We establish the record first." "What about the political infrastructure in Incheon?" Nyla asked. "His municipal connections." Junho opened his own laptop. "Seongwon's Incheon connections are solid at the district administrative level, but they have a ceiling. 2 specific officials are deeply embedded. But the third, the one with actual port authority oversight, has been cooperating with a separate national audit for 11 weeks. He doesn't know Seongwon well enough to protect him if protecting him becomes professionally costly." "Make it professionally costly," Nyla said. Yoonho looked at her. A brief look. Not unfriendly, just recalibrating. The look of a man adjusting his model of a person. "Yes," he said. "We can do that." Min-jae spoke for the first time in 20 minutes. "There's still the physical security question," he said. "The man outside your building tonight is gone. I handled that an hour ago. But Seongwon knows this address. He's demonstrated he can move faster than our security rotations. Before we file anything, before we put pressure on his political connections, he's going to feel it coming. And when he does, he'll move on her," Junho finished. "Not to negotiate, to use." The room went quiet. Nyla looked at Min-jae. "Where?" she said. "Not here." He held her gaze. "I have a location. Secure. Nobody knows it except Junho and Woo. A location that belongs to your operation. A location that is safe." She breathed in slowly. She thought about her apartment, the Insadong watercolor, the consulting firm outline, the coffee maker, the 6 weeks of careful assembly. She thought about her mother's address in a document in Incheon. She thought about what it meant to make the next move before Seongwon made his, and what it cost, and whether the cost was payable. "How long?" she said. 48 hours. Long enough to file the counter-documentation and move on the Incheon connections. After that, the risk profile changes significantly. 48 hours, she repeated. She looked at Ji-yeon, who had been quiet and present, and whose expression gave her exactly nothing instructional, which was the right thing to give her. "All right," Nyla said. The word came out of her without hesitation, and she meant it without reservation, and she was clear-eyed about the fact that she was agreeing to be moved to a location controlled by a man she was furious with in order to survive a situation that his choices had substantially contributed to creating, so that she could use the work of her own hands to build a way out for both of them. She was clear-eyed about all of it. "We leave in 30 minutes, Min-jae said. She nodded once and went to pack a bag. She was in her bedroom pulling clothes from the closet when she heard her phone buzz on the bed. She glanced at it. Unknown number. Different from the previous ones. A different prefix, a different pattern. She picked it up. "I want to be clear about something," Cho Seung-won's voice said. No preamble. The warmth was completely gone. What was underneath it was colder than she'd expected, and flatter, and more honest. "Everything that's happening in your apartment right now, the counter document, the conversation about prosecutors and port officials, and 48 hours in a safe location." A pause. "I know about all of it." She stood completely still with a sweater in one hand. "I have a source in that room, Ms. Adebayo," he said. "I've had one since this morning, which means the plan you've just agreed to is a plan I've been listening to for the last hour." Another pause, calibrated and cold. "You're not moving to a safe location. You're walking into exactly where I need you to be." The sweater dropped from her hand. So here's what actually happens in the next 30 minutes, Seung-won said. You walk out of that bedroom and you tell Kang Min-jae that you've changed your mind. You meet with me tonight, alone, your choice of public location, and we have the honest conversation I proposed this morning. Or, he let the words sit. I make a call to Accra. The bedroom was very small suddenly. You have 4 minutes to decide, he said. After that, the call gets made regardless of what you choose. Consider it an incentive for efficiency. She looked at the bedroom door. Beyond it, Min-jae, Junho, Woo, one of whom had been feeding information to Cho Seung-won since morning. One of whom had been sitting in her living room, listening to everything, and reporting it through a channel she hadn't detected and Min-jae hadn't detected, and Junho, careful, thorough, information processing Junho, hadn't detected either. She looked at her phone. 3 minutes and 40 seconds. She thought about Woo, who had sat against the wall the entire meeting and said nothing. She thought about the specific quality of nothing. Not passive nothing, not background nothing, but the focused and deliberate nothing of a man performing invisibility. She thought about how Min-jae had introduced him only as Woo, with no function, no explanation, no context. She thought about why you would bring a man to a meeting like this and introduce him with no function unless the function was one you didn't want named out loud. A witness. He had called Woo a witness, or he had called him that because it was what Min-jae believed he was. 3 minutes and 10 seconds. She looked at the bedroom door. She made a decision. She opened the door and walked back into the living room with the phone in her hand, and she looked at the 4 people in her apartment, Min-jae near the window, Junho at the table, Ji-yeon on the couch, Woo against the wall, and she held the phone out toward the room with the speaker active and Seung-won's silence filling it like something. 2 minutes and 50 seconds. That was what remained on Seung-won's timeline when Nyla walked back into the living room with the phone held out in front of her like something she was presenting for examination rather than hiding. 4 people looked at her. She looked at Woo. He was exactly as he had been for the entire meeting, back against the wall, arms loose at his sides, face arranged in the particular blankness of a man performing furniture. But something shifted in him when she walked out of the bedroom with the phone in her hand and the speaker active. Something small and involuntary. A micro-adjustment of posture. A fractional tightening around the eyes. The kind of shift that happens when a situation changes in a way you weren't prepared for. She watched his hands. His right hand moved toward his jacket pocket by approximately 2 centimeters before he stopped it. It's him, she said. Not a question. She was looking directly at Woo, and she said it to the room, and she watched Woo's face complete the transition from blank to something that had real calculation in it. Min-jae turned from the window. He looked at Woo, then at Nyla, then at the phone in her hand with Seung-won's silence breathing through the speaker. 3 seconds. The same 3 seconds she had counted at other critical moments in the last 48 hours, but this time with a different quality. Not the 3 seconds of a man deciding how much truth to give her, but the 3 seconds of a man updating every model he had built in the last 4 years against a single data point he hadn't anticipated. Woo, Min-jae said. His voice was completely flat. Woo moved, not toward the door. That was the thing that made it fast and dangerous and nearly wrong. He moved toward Nyla, which meant toward the phone, which meant toward the active call that was the only evidence in the room that could be acted on immediately. And Min-jae was already moving before Nyla had processed what Woo intended, and Junho was up from the table with the speed of a man who had been in rooms like this before, even if this particular room had a watercolor from Insadong on the wall and a consulting firm outline open on the laptop. What followed lasted 11 seconds and was, Nyla would think later, the most concentrated 11 seconds of her adult life. Woo reached for the phone. Min-jae reached Woo. The impact was not elegant. It was 2 men in a small living room with furniture in the way, grunt and collision, and the particular sound of a shoulder hitting the wall hard enough to knock the Insadong watercolor sideways on its hook. Ji-yeon was off the couch and pressed against the far wall with the alert stillness of someone who had assessed the geometry of the room and found the safest position. Junho had Woo's right arm in a control hold that looked practiced and permanent. Nyla stepped back twice. She kept the phone in her hand. She did not drop it. From the speaker, Seong-won's voice came through the noise with the particular calm of a man listening to something collapse. I'm going to need your answer, Ms. Adebayo. Time is Cho Seong-won. Her voice cut across the room noise and through the speaker simultaneously, steady in a way that surprised her when she heard it coming out of her own mouth. Your source is contained. Your timeline is done. And in approximately 4 minutes, I'm going to send a document to a national prosecution contact that makes this conversation the least of your problems tonight. A silence on the line. Woo stopped struggling. He was against the wall with Junho's hold on him and Min-jae a foot away, and whatever fight had been in him had left with the efficiency of air from a punctured thing. He looked at the floor. His breathing was audible. 4 minutes is optimistic, Seong-won said. 3.5 then. She looked at Min-jae directly. Send it now. Min-jae looked at her for 1 second. Then he pulled out his phone and texted Junho a single word, and Junho, without releasing Woo's arm, reached across the table with his free hand and executed 4 keystrokes on his laptop and looked up and nodded once. The counter document, the provenance records, the Daehyun theft documentation, filed to the National Prosecution Contact's secure intake system with a timestamp that was, as of that moment, permanent and unretractable, and part of the official record. It's sent, Min-jae said. Did you hear that? Nyla said into the phone. Another silence. Longer this time. You've created a significant problem for yourself, Seong-won said finally. The warmth was entirely gone. What was underneath it, fully exposed now, was not rage. It was colder than rage. More precise. The voice of a man recalculating from a position he hadn't expected to occupy. The document you filed contains information about Min-jae's 2021 transactions. You've put him in the record as much as you've put me there. Yes, Nyla said. I know that. Then you understand that what you've just done is guaranteed that the investigation touches everyone in that room, including the man you're apparently protecting. I'm not protecting anyone, she said. I'm establishing the record. All of it. The complete picture, not the piece you would have used, and not the piece Min-jae would have preferred. The whole architecture, from 2018 forward, with every actor named, including him. She paused. A prosecutor looking at the full record will see 4 years of primary irregularities built by Lee Dae-hyun and 2 other executives, 1 secondary layer of bridge financing during a liquidity crisis, and 1 criminal operation in Incheon that used stolen proprietary documents to build a financial mirror structure for purposes of extortion. She kept her voice level. Which part of that do you think looks worst when it's laid out completely? The silence that followed was the longest one yet. When Seong-won spoke again, his voice had the specific quality of a man who has looked at a board and found that the position he believed was winning is, from a different angle, already lost. This isn't over. No, Nyla agreed, but it's changed, significantly. She ended the call. The room was quiet except for Woo's breathing and the distant sound of Seoul traffic and Ji-yeon exhaling slowly from her position against the far wall. Nyla set the phone on the table. She looked at Woo. How long? She said. He didn't answer. He was looking at the floor with the particular focus of a man concentrating on the texture of carpet rather than the faces in the room. How long has he had you? She said again. Not loud, just precise. Min-jae spoke before Woo could decide whether to answer. How much does he know about the prosecution contact? Woo's jaw tightened. The name, Min-jae said quietly. Does he have the name? Woo said nothing. Min-jae looked at Junho. Something passed between them. Not a word, not a gesture exactly. Just the compressed communication of 2 people who had worked together long enough that the signal didn't need decoding. I need 20 minutes with him, Junho said. Not here. The car, Min-jae said. Junho moved Woo toward the door with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this before and found no particular drama in it. The door opened and closed, and the sound of footsteps in the hallway diminished toward the elevator. And then the apartment was down to 3 people, Min-jae, Nyla, and Ji-yeon, who was still against the far wall, and who looked at Nyla with an expression that asked, silently and precisely, whether she needed Ji-yeon to stay or go. Go home, Nyla said quietly. I'll call you tomorrow. Ji-yeon picked up her laptop in her bag. She paused at the door. The work we built today was good, she said, not as comfort, as fact. Then she left. The door closed for the second time. The apartment was very quiet. The Insadong watercolor was still hanging crooked on its hook, where Wu's shoulder had hit the wall. Min-jae crossed the room and straightened it. He did it without apparent thought, just reached up and leveled the frame with 2 fingers and stepped back. Then he seemed to become aware of what he'd done and stood there for a moment looking at the watercolor with his back to her, his hands at his sides. The prosecution contact, she said. If Seong-won has the name, Yoonho will know in 20 minutes. If he does, we move the filing to a secondary contact and we notify the primary to expect pressure. He turned around. The document is filed. The timestamp exists. Even if Seong-won moves to suppress it through his Incheon connection, it's already in a system that requires multiple layers of authorization to access or modify. It will take him days to even understand the full scope of what was filed. He paused. He'll move on Dae-hyun first. Cover his own exposure. That's what I'd do. And Dae-hyun? We'll spend the next several months discovering that building a financial architecture for an organized crime operation using stolen corporate documents is a category of mistake that tends to define the rest of your professional life. She nodded slowly. She walked to the couch and sat down, not with her legs tucked under her the way she usually sat, just down, both feet on the floor, the posture of someone who has been standing for a very long time and needed to stop. You included my 2021 transactions in the filing, Min-jae said. He was still standing near the wall, not moving toward her. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. The document could have been structured to… No, she said. It couldn't. Not honestly. She looked at him directly. You moved money through compromised accounts to stabilize a company that employed hundreds of people, and the reason those accounts were already compromised is because Dae-hyun and 2 other men had been using them for personal enrichment for 4 years before you touched them. That context matters. A prosecutor looking at the full picture will see the difference between what you did and what they did. She paused. But what you did still happened. It's still in the record. You don't get to have that erased because the context is mitigating. He looked at her for a long moment. No, he said. I don't. This might cost you. The investigation could still go somewhere you don't want it to go. I can't control that, and I didn't try to control it. I just told the truth as completely as I could document it. I know. I need you to understand that I would have done the same thing regardless of what it cost you. That wasn't the variable. I know, he said again. And then, after a pause, that's why I trust it. The apartment absorbed that. She looked at the coffee table, the ring from her coffee cup on the coaster, the corner of Junho's laptop still visible at the edge of the table, the ordinary aftermath of an extraordinary 2 hours. Woo, she said. How long has he been with your organization? 3 years. And you didn't see it? No. Seong-won recruited him or turned him. Turned him. Almost certainly. Woo has a sister in Incheon. She's involved with a man who has connections to Seong-won's operation. That's the most likely pressure point. Min-jae's voice was even, but there was something underneath it. Not embarrassment, exactly. Something colder and more permanent. The specific weight of having been inside a betrayal without detecting it. I brought him into a room in your apartment because I considered him trustworthy, and he spent an hour reporting everything to Seong-won through a secondary phone I didn't check for. How does that happen? To someone as careful as you? He moved to the chair. He sat in it the way he'd sat the first night, facing the door, elbows on knees, the posture of a man carrying something heavy enough that leaning forward distributes the weight better. You trust people over time. The trust builds through repeated small confirmations. And then someone with enough patience and the right leverage finds the single thing that overrides all of it. He looked at his hands. His sister. He would have done almost anything to keep her safe. Can you… She stopped. Can I what? His sister. Can you… Is there something you can do about the pressure on her? Remove it. Min-jae looked up from his hands. He looked at her with an expression she had only seen a handful of times. Stripped of calculation, stripped of the operational layer, just the actual face of the man underneath all of it. Yes, he said quietly. I can do that. Then do it. Not for Wu. For her. He nodded once. He took out his phone and sent a message she couldn't see, and then put it back in his pocket, and they sat in the quiet of the apartment for a moment without speaking. "What happens now?" she said. "Tonight. The next 48 hours." He walked her through it methodically. Junho would extract what he needed from Wu, and Wu would be gone from the city by morning, relocated with enough money to start over somewhere that wasn't Seoul, and enough understanding of what he was leaving behind to make that relocation permanent. The prosecution filing would trigger a review process that would take weeks to build into something actionable. It was a beginning, not an ending, but it was a record, and a record had weight. Seung-won would spend the next several days managing exposure on multiple fronts simultaneously. The Incheon political connections, the Daehyun liability, the financial mirror structure that was now part of an official filing rather than a private weapon. He would not, during that time, have the operational bandwidth to move on Nyla. "And after the several days," she said, "the investigation either develops or it doesn't." "If it develops, Nyla said. "I know what's in that document. It develops." He looked at her. "Then in 4 to 6 weeks, Seung-won's operation is managing a formal investigation rather than an operational expansion. The Busan partnership stalls. His Incheon connections distance themselves. Daehyun becomes a liability he needs to contain rather than an asset he can use." A pause. "He doesn't come after you. The cost-benefit of that changes the moment we filed tonight. And your exposure is real, and I'll manage it." He said it simply, without the usual operational veneer. "I made choices. The record reflects them. What happens with that is what happens." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're not angry," she said, "that I put you in the filing?" "No." "Why not?" He looked at the window. The Seoul night was doing what it always did, going on regardless, gold and silver, and the permanent low hum of a city that didn't organize itself around any individual's crisis. "Because for 3 years I watched people erase your name from things you built, and you just put my name on something accurately, completely, without softening it." He turned back to her. "That's more respect than I've shown you in most of our history." The weight of that moved through the room slowly, the way heavy things move, without hurry, taking up exactly the space they require. Barasat. Yunho came back at 10:40. Seung-won had the prosecution contact's name. Junho had already reached the secondary contact, a prosecutor in the Financial Crimes Division at the national level who had been building a Incheon port corruption case independently for 14 months, and who had received the counter-document filing with the particular quiet intensity of a person who has just been handed the piece they were missing. The primary contact had been notified and was implementing his own protective protocols. Wu was in a car heading south. Junho stood in the doorway of Nyla's apartment looking like a man who had processed 10 hours of compressed events and was still standing because standing was the thing he did. He looked at Nyla with the same recalibrating look he'd given her earlier. "The secondary prosecutor," he said to her, "she's going to want to talk to you at some point. Not tonight, but soon. You're the only person with comprehensive working knowledge of Daesung Global's original financial architecture." "I know," Nyla said. "I'll talk to her." Yunho looked at Min-jae. Something passed between them. Not the compressed operational signal from earlier, something longer and more personal. The look of two people who have been through a version of fire together and come out on the other side and are taking inventory of what remains. "Go home, Junho," Min-jae said. Junho went. The door closed for the third and final time that night. It was past 11. Nyla was in the kitchen making tea. Actual tea this time, with intention, the kind she drank when she needed something warm that wasn't coffee. Min-jae was in the living room. She could hear him. Small sounds, the shift of weight, the particular quality of a large person trying to occupy space quietly. She brought 2 cups out. She set one on the table near the chair where he was sitting and took the couch with her own cup, and they sat in the ordinary quiet of 2 people who had run out of operational matters to discuss and were now in the territory of everything else. "Daehyun," she said after a while. Not angrily. It had moved past the place where anger lived. "When you knew what he'd done, when Junho confirmed it this morning, what did you feel?" Min-jae wrapped both hands around the teacup. He looked at it. "That I should have removed him from the company 2 years earlier. that I'd known he was a specific kind of problem and I'd managed it quietly instead of addressing it directly. He paused. The same thing I seem to have done with most situations in my life. The quiet management strategy. Yes. How's that been working? A brief, genuine exhale. Not quite a laugh, but something in the vicinity of it. Poorly, on balance. She drank her tea. He hated me, she said. Dae-hyun. Not because I threatened him. I never did anything to threaten him directly. I just did my work, and I was better at it than he was, and he couldn't… She stopped. He couldn't stand that I took up space in a place he believed was his, that I existed competently in his vicinity. That was the whole of it. Yes, and 3 years of that came to a head in an Incheon criminal operation. She shook her head slightly. The amount of energy it takes to hate someone that thoroughly for that long. I can't even imagine being that exhausted. Some people find it easier than alternatives. Alternatives being what? Doing the work yourself. Existing without needing someone else to be smaller. Something like that. She set her cup down. She sat for a moment looking at the Insadong watercolor. Straight on its hook again, the woman in front of the sea returned to her proper angle. She thought about the market where she'd bought it. A Sunday afternoon, first autumn after arriving in Seoul, not knowing anyone in the city well enough to call for company. Buying something just because she liked it. That had been a small act of self-determination that she had not understood the significance of at the time. She understood it better now. I'm not going back to Daesung Global, she said. Not in any capacity. Not as a witness, not as a consultant. I'll speak to the prosecutor about the financial architecture because that's the right thing to do, and because Dae-hyun doesn't get to have built what he built without it being accounted for. But I'm not rebuilding anyone else's empire, not for anyone. I know. The consulting firm. I'm registering it this week. The name I chose, the structure I built. She looked at him. That's mine. All of it. Yes. And if the investigation creates complications for your operation, if the prosecution follows the 2021 accounts and it gets difficult, I can't protect you from that. I won't try to. I'm not asking you to. I know you're not asking. I'm telling you it won't happen regardless of… She stopped, reorganized. Regardless of what else is true about this. He looked at her steadily. His face was tired in the same way it had been when he arrived the night before. The deep tiredness of someone who has been managing the weight of a very specific kind of loneliness for a very long time and has stopped being able to hide it effectively. What is true about this? He said quietly, not as a challenge, as a genuine question. She held his gaze. I don't know all of it yet, she said honestly. I know that you've made choices I can't excuse and choices I can understand, and a number of choices I'm still sorting into which category they belong. I know that for 3 years you were the only person in that building who saw me completely, and that you used that knowledge sometimes to protect me and sometimes to protect yourself, and that the line between those two things was not always where you told yourself it was. She paused. I know that you came when I called. That's not nothing, but it's not everything either. No. I need time, she said. Not manufactured time. Not 48 hours until the situation resolves. Actual time, where we both know what we're doing and what it is and what it isn't. Yes, he said, and you have to tell me things, not after you've decided I need to know them. When you know them. Yes. That one's going to be harder for you than the rest. Something moved in his expression. Yes, he said. It will be. She picked up her teacup. It was almost empty. She drank the last of it. Go home, Minjai, she said, not coldly. In the same register she'd used earlier, the register that was something between instruction and invitation, the register she'd been unconsciously developing for 3 years of navigating the complicated geography of him. He stood. He put on his coat, the same dark coat dried now from last night's rain, no longer carrying the weight of water. He crossed the room toward the door and stopped when he was level with the couch. The consulting firm, he said. The name you chose. She looked up at him. Adebayo and Associates, she said. He looked at it, not at her exactly, but at the name in the air between them, the way you look at something you want to remember accurately. It's right, he said. He left. She sat in the quiet of the apartment for a long time after. Not processing. She had done her processing. Not planning. The immediate future had its own momentum now. The prosecution filing and the secondary contact in the week ahead that would require more of her and take more from her and give more back than she could currently calculate. Not waiting for anything, just sitting. She got up eventually and washed the 2 teacups. She put them on the drying rack side by side. She turned off the kitchen light. She stood in the dark of the hallway for a moment and looked at the living room. The straight watercolor, the consulting firm outline still glowing on the laptop screen, the chair where Min-jae had sat 2 nights in a row at the end of the world. She crossed to the laptop and looked at the document. She changed 3 figures that had been bothering her all week. She saved the file. She looked at the name at the top of the document, which she had typed herself weeks ago, which appeared in no meeting agenda she hadn't written herself and on no presentation she hadn't built from scratch. Adebayo and Associates, Strategic Operations Consulting. Her name, her structure, her call. She closed the laptop and went to bed. That's 3 weeks later, the Korean Financial Intelligence Unit opened a formal investigation into port-adjacent financial operations in Incheon, citing irregularities in the administrative records of 3 district officials and the discovery of stolen proprietary documents from Daesung Global Holdings being used in the construction of fraudulent shell company structures. Lee Dae-hyun was named in the initial filing as a person of interest. His lawyers released a statement. His statement was noted by the investigation and did not materially alter the direction of it. Cho Seung-won's operation in Incheon did not collapse in a single dramatic moment. It contracted. The Busan partnership stalled within 2 weeks as the freight brokerage company quietly distanced itself from any structure connected to an active financial investigation. 2 of his 3 Incheon municipal connections ceased returning calls. The third, facing the independent port corruption audit that had been building for 14 months, began cooperating with investigators in exchange for considerations that would take a separate year to fully negotiate. Seung-won was still operating. He was smaller. He was being watched. He knew it. There was no confrontation on a bridge. There was no dramatic final meeting in a warehouse overlooking the Han River. What happened was slower and less cinematic, and in the end, more permanent. The gradual withdrawal of infrastructure, of protection, of the political and financial scaffolding that any operation of that scale required to function. Without it, the thing that remained was still dangerous but was no longer the specific threat it had been. Nyla registered Adebayo and Associates in the 3rd week of the month following the night everything broke open. She signed the papers herself in a registrar's office in Jongno, took the official documents, walked out into a Seoul afternoon that was cold and bright with the particular sharpness of early winter, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment holding the folder. A stranger walked past and glanced at her, the brief, incurious glance of city people moving through their own days, and she smiled at nothing in particular and walked to the subway. The pharmaceutical distribution company's CEO meeting happened 4 days after registration. She arrived with a presentation that had her name on every slide, every section, every appendix. She left with a signed engagement letter. Her mother called that evening. "Something's different," her mother said, 30 seconds into the conversation. "I registered the firm." "That's not what's different." A pause. "You sound like yourself." Nyla sat on her couch in the early winter dark, the city outside her window doing its permanent glittering business, and thought about what it meant to sound like yourself after a period of sounding like someone who was carefully rebuilding herself from the outside in. "I think I am," she said, and the complicated situation. "Being managed," she paused, "by the people responsible for it." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "And the man?" "Ma, I'm just asking." "I know you're just asking." Nyla looked at the window, at the city, at the particular cold winter light on the glass. "It's complicated. Most things worth anything are." "When did you get wise?" "I've always been wise. You were too busy to notice." A warmth in her voice that was genuine and specific, and the particular warmth of someone who had been frightened for their daughter and was allowing herself to stop being frightened. "Come home for a visit. Soon, when you can." "I will," Nyla said. "Soon." She saw Min-jae 6 days after the filing, not by arrangement or not by explicit arrangement. He was walking out of a building on Tehran Row when she was walking past it on her way to a client meeting, and the city, which did not organize itself around anyone's emotional readiness, placed them on the same stretch of pavement at the same moment. He stopped. She stopped. He was in a coat she didn't recognize, new probably, or one she hadn't seen before, and he looked tired in the way he'd looked the night he came to her door, but differently. A tiredness with less weight behind it, a tiredness that had been paying down a debt. "The investigation," she said. "Moving forward. My legal team is managing our exposure. It's manageable." "I know. I spoke to the prosecutor last week." He looked at her. "She told me." "She would?" Nyla shifted her bag on her shoulder. "The pharmaceutical firm. We started the engagement." "I heard. Through Gion. You're keeping track." "I notice things," he said. "You know that." She looked at him on that cold, bright soul sidewalk. The man who had watched her for 3 years from behind glass, who had sent watchers without asking and made decisions without telling and loved her in the way of someone who had learned that love was safest when kept at an operational distance, and who was standing in front of her now without any of that scaffolding. Just a tired man in a coat she didn't recognize, holding eye contact and not pretending. "There's a cafe 2 blocks from here," she said. "I have an hour before my meeting." He looked at her. The calculation she was used to reading in his face was not there. Something cleaner was there instead. The unguarded expression of someone who knows exactly what they want and has decided to stop disguising it as something more managed. "Yes," he said. They walked the 2 blocks side by side through the cold soul morning, not touching, not filling the silence with anything unnecessary. The city moved around them, the traffic and the delivery trucks, and the ordinary Tuesday people buying coffee and checking their phones and living their unexamined days, and neither of them needed it to be anything other than what it was. A beginning, not a clean one, not an easy one, the kind that had honest scars already built in, that required actual work from 2 people who were imperfect in specific and documented ways, that would ask more of both of them than the easier version they might have had if 3 years in a criminal operation and 41 pages of financial records hadn't been the ground it grew from. But real. And real, Nyla had come to understand. Standing at doors in the rain, sitting on kitchen floors counting seconds, filing documents that put everyone's name on what they'd actually done, real was the only kind worth walking toward. She pushed open the cafe door. The warmth of it came out to meet them both.